Okay, we carry on now. Last week, we looked at chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, which ends with the revelation that after Jesus provided purification of sins, he was exalted far above every angel. So he was, in the words of, you see it here, it says, after providing purification of the sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty in heaven, having become as much greater than the angels as the name he has inherited is superior to theirs. So he was, in the words of Philippians chapter 2, verse 9, he was given the name that is above every name. He is Lord of all. And then in verses 5 through 14, his superiority, the superiority of Jesus, it's elaborated on. And we read, he says, "For to which of the angels did he ever say, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you'? And again, 'I will be to him as a father, and he will be to me as a son.' And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, 'Let all the angels of God worship him.' Regarding the angels, he says, 'He who makes winds his angels, and a flame of fire his ministers.' But regarding the Son, he says, 'Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. And the scepter of justice is the scepter of your kingdom. You loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, anointed you with oil of gladness above your companions. And you, at the beginning, Lord, firmly established the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will pass away, but you continue, and they will all wear out as a garment, and you will roll them up as a cloak, as a garment. They will also be changed, but you are the same, and your years will not end. And regarding which of the angels has he ever said, 'Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool at your feet'? Are they not all ministering spirits, being sent for service for the sake of those who are about to inherit salvation?" So Jesus' exaltation to God's right hand, this made him greater than the angels because, or for, no angel has been similarly exalted. That is, God never said to any angel, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." And this is from Psalm 2, verse 7. Or, "I will be to him as a father, and he will be to me as a son." That's from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. Now you know that in the Old Testament, angels are occasionally called sons of God in a collective sense. They're occasionally referred to that way, but no one angel was called God's son in a unique sense. And the argument here that he makes, it assumes this inextricable link between being declared to be God's son and being exalted in the manner of Christ. So there's this link. These two things are tied together. To be exalted in the manner of Christ is to be declared to be God's son in a way distinct from any angel. To be exalted that way is to have God say, to be exalted as Jesus has been exalted, to be seated at the right hand of God. That is to have God say, whether he says it literally in association with the exaltation, or whether he says it symbolically by virtue of the exaltation, it is to have God say in that exaltation, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," or "I will be to him as a father, and he will be to me as a son." See, that's why the absence of that declaration to any angel means that no angel was similarly exalted. You see, because if they had been similarly exalted, then they would have had that same declaration, because that declaration is inherent in the exaltation. So this is what he's saying. And thus the Son in his exaltation, was made greater than the angels. That's his point. The Son is made greater than the angels because no angel has had God say, "You are my Son," in this sense. And he says that in the exaltation. Okay, so he's greater than the angels. George Guthrie says in his commentary, the early church understood these passages to refer to Jesus' induction into his royal position as King of the universe at the resurrection and exaltation. With these events, God vindicated Jesus as Messiah and established his eternal kingdom. God's becoming the Son's Father then refers to God's open expression of their relationship upon Christ's enthronement, an interpretation that fits both Old Testament contexts in question. And Craig Koester, in his commentary, says most interpreters connect this text with Christ's resurrection and exaltation. Since the quotation supports the exaltation mentioned in chapter 1, verse 2b, and since chapter 5, verse 5, it refers to the eternal high priest in heaven. Similarly, Acts 13, 15 to 41 relates Psalm 2:7 to Jesus' resurrection. Acts 4:25 to 28 relates other parts of Psalm 2 to Jesus' passion. And in Romans 1:4, Paul said Jesus is declared to be Son of God by resurrection from the dead. So I want you to see here what's going on with this. Now, Psalm 2 is interesting. It was Christological, very important in the early church. And Psalm 2, you'll recall, it speaks of the nation's rebellion against God and his anointing the King of Israel, against God and his anointed King of Israel. So the nations are rebelling against God and his king, and it says that they rebel in vain. They rebel in vain because God, the heavenly king, has placed his king, his man, his chosen on the throne in Israel. And therefore, God will provide him dominion over all the nations. And then verses 6 and 7 make clear that God's becoming the father of the king, his metaphorical begetting of the king, his becoming the father of the king, that refers to the king's enthronement. It refers to the king's formal public identification as Israel's king. He becomes God's son at that time, in the sense he at that time assumes in a public way the new God-appointed role of ruler. Okay, so this is what you see in Psalm and elsewhere, that it is at the king's enthronement that he becomes God's son. Now, though Jesus was the unique Son of God from divine conception, right? I mean, God the Son is God, but he comes as the God-man Jesus, and as the God-man, he was the unique Son of God. From conception, you see that in Gabriel's words to Mary in Luke 1:35. And you see it in the announcement at Jesus' baptism in Luke chapter 3, verse 22. So though Jesus was the unique Son of God from divine conception, in his resurrection and the associated ascension back to heaven, he, as the God-man Jesus, as the Israelite king, the Messiah, he, in that role, he assumed in a public way the new God-appointed role of Israel's ultimate king, the supremely powerful Lord of Lords. This is the fulfillment of the promise, the Davidic promise, that your son will sit on the throne. Jesus, a son of David, has been exalted to the throne, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And God at that time exalted him, you see, to a new stage or a new phase of his messianic career. And as God became the father of the merely human kings of Israel upon their enthronement, as you see in Psalm 2, he, in an analogous sense, became Jesus' Father upon his enthronement, upon his public exaltation to ultimate kingship. Now, that doesn't mean that God was not Jesus' Father before that time in a different sense. He, of course, was his Father. That's what I say. You see the announcement that is made by Gabriel to Mary. It doesn't mean he wasn't his father before that time in a different sense. It means only that he became his father at that time in a Psalm 2 verse 7 sense. Just as the Israelite king became the Son of God upon his enthronement, that public indication that he is now assuming this new God-appointed role, so the Son of Man, Jesus, becomes God's Father in a Psalm 2:7 sense. You see, that's important to recognize. And this resurrection-related exaltation to a new stage or phase of Jesus' messianic career, you see it, it's evident in the text we read last week. Perhaps most clear here in Philippians chapter 2, 5 to 11. It says starting in last part of 7, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, also God highly exalted him and graciously gave it to him the name that is above every name. You see, so it's after this humbling of himself in this faithful service that he is then exalted above all as the ultimate Israelite king, the ultimate Davidic king who had been prophesied. So he's then lifted above and he's Lord of all. So there we're told, right, that Jesus, God the Son, chose to forego the prerogatives of divinity in obedience to the will of the Father, only to have bestowed on him, as a result of his faithfulness unto death, the supremely powerful position of Lord of Lords. And that's who Jesus is, and that's what he's talking about here when he talks about these kinds of things. And then in this context, the reference to the Son as the firstborn, well, that's a title of honor expressing his priority in rank. Like we might say the top dog. You see, the firstborn, that's what it means. The firstborn had special privileges, special prerogatives. He had a special place in the Father's heart. The firstborn shared the Father's authority. He inherited the lion's share of the property. So what this reference here to the firstborn emphasizes the preeminence of Jesus, right? Far above. He's not an angel. He's way out of their league. You see, way out of their league. He's far above all such things. And that's significant. So Paul, right? Paul in Colossians chapter 1 verse 15 refers to Jesus as the firstborn over all creation. Meaning he is supreme over all creation. In that sense, you see, in that sense of status or entitlement, or as I say, top dog. So the superiority of the Son to the angels, it's evident from the fact, he says, that when God brings him into the world, when he brings him into the world, he says, let all the angels of God worship him. Okay, and this is from Psalm 97:7, Septuagint. The versification is Psalm 96:7. But this clearly indicates Jesus' divinity, right? I mean, his deity. He said, let all the angels worship him. They're commanded to worship him, and only God is a proper object of worship. And here, this is something that's commanded. Now, there is a question, right, as to when this bringing of the Son into the world, where he says, let all the angels of God worship him. There's a question of when this takes place. What's this referring to, right? And that really depends on the meaning of the word oikumene, which is rendered here world, What is the sense of that word in this context? And the context very much favors understanding oikumene, or world, there as referring to the heavenly world. The heavenly world, you see, which is why most leading commentators understand it that way. So when you see this, you've read this, and you say into the world, you're naturally thinking this world. And I'm thinking that's not the way to understand it. It's more the heavenly world in this context. And you say, that sounds crazy to me. Well, most scholars understand it that way, or most commentators. And let me just rattle off some that I wrote down. That's Bruce, Lane, Guthrie, Ellingworth, De Silva, Coaster, Johnson, O'Brien, Cockerell, Peterson, and Moo. So that's no small gathering. Okay, now whether that, if you count heads, whether they're in the majority, I don't know. But I'm just saying, this is not weird. Okay, it's not playing fast and loose with the meaning of oikumene. It's, I think, contextually, that is what is being said. So in that case, you see, if that's the right reading, and I think it is, then this is another reference to Jesus' exaltation. Right? It's at Christ's enthronement upon his ascension to heaven, having completed the work of the Father. It is this enthronement upon his ascension to heaven that all the angels bow before him as he rises. And this, I couldn't help this brought to my mind, not saying that this is necessarily the same, but it brought to my mind this just wonderful section in Revelation 5:6-14. He says, "And between the throne and the four living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain." Is there any question about who that lamb is? That's Jesus. He says, "with 7 horns and with 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And he went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who is seated on the throne, the Father. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sang a new song, saying, 'Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation. And you have made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they shall reign on the earth.' Then I looked and I heard around the throne and the living creatures and the elders the voice of many angels, numbering myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, 'Worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing.' And I heard every creature in heaven, on earth, under the earth, and in the sea, and all that's in them, saying, 'To him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever.' And the 4 living creatures said amen, and the elders fell down and worshiped." All right, so when I see this thing, this about the angels, let all the angels worship him. Do you see who he is? Right? Do you see who he is? He's that magnificent. He's that majestic. Here's how William Lane in his commentary explains it. He says, "The context speaks of the sacrificial death of the Son followed by his exaltation. Oikumene then concerns neither the incarnation, his first coming, nor the parousia, his second coming, but the entrance of Christ into the heavenly world following his sacrificial death. Christ's entrance into the world in his incarnation entailed the humiliation of being made lower than the angels, 2:7 and 9. But his entrance into the oikumene signified his enthronement and exaltation above the angels. The context requires that oikumene be understood as the heavenly world of eschatological salvation into which the Son entered at his ascension." And then here we see Luke Timothy Johnson similarly says, "Oikumene is often translated as world and can certainly bear the sense of inhabited world. But for that meaning, Hebrews uses cosmos. In only one other place does Hebrews use oikumene. 2:5. It was not to angels that he subjected the world to come. It is reasonable to conclude then that oikumene here means world not in the sense of the empirical cosmos, but in the sense of the divine presence. If this is the case, then the introduction of the Son refers once more to his enthronement. After he had for a little while been made lower than the angels, he's now crowned with glory and honor. The Son's coming into the world refers here not to his incarnation or to his parousia, but to the precise scene envisaged by the prologue itself, the exaltation of the Son to God's right hand. And I think that's what's being said, and I think that's what is what's going on there. Now, it's possible to understand it as a reference to the parousia. I think that's more likely than as a reference to the incarnation. But I see it's possible as taking this as a reference to Jesus' second coming. You see? And at that time, you say, well, why do you think that would fit? Well, at that time, every being, right? When Jesus returns, every being, angels included, shall kneel in honor of Jesus' name, and every tongue shall openly confess that Jesus is Lord. Right? You see that in Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. So I could see it that way, but that just seems foreign or more removed to me from the context of talking about his exaltation here. But whenever the bringing of the Son into the world takes place, okay, if you say, well, I hear what you're saying, but I don't know about this going to heavenly world thing. Okay? However you go with it. Okay? If you think it's the parousia and not the entrance in, at the ascension, whenever it takes place, the fact that all the angels are commanded to worship him, whenever that is, right? The fact they're commanded to worship him, that establishes his superiority to the angels. Right? He's a different order. He is divine. He is God. They are to worship him, and that's the main point. He's trying to get them to see, because here are people who are being tempted to turn back and to abandon. And the punchline is, to whom shall you go? Do you see who he is? To turn from him is to turn from God. Right? It's not, well, I go over here, I'll pick this one, I'll pick that one. No. It's not like that at all. Now, the superiority of the Son to the angels is evident in the fact that God wins his angels or messengers, you can render that word either way, wins his angels or messengers, and a flame of fire his ministers. Now, that's Psalm 104:4 in the Masoretic text. The Septuagint is Psalm 103:4. But the point, you see, is that angels, as majestic and powerful as they are, right? Angels are awesome. You see how people react when they see them. Not some chubby little baby flying around. Isn't he cute? They see these angels and they're, whoa! Right? People just, all right. So they're awesome. And that's the whole point. You see, that's how people perceived them and understood that they were mighty and glorious and amazing. He's far above them. Right, he's far above them. But the superiority, it's evident from this, where he says he wins his angels, messengers, and a flame of fire his ministers. And as I say, the point that as majestic and powerful as they are in some way comparable to the other created things that God uses for his purposes. You see where it says, he who wins his angels. Right? So they're comparable just to stuff that God makes use of in his creation. They're a different order than Jesus. So here you see that he makes use of, but they are but creatures sent by God as messengers and servants of others, as we'll see in verse 14. Now, this quote from the Greek translation, this quote from the Septuagint, okay, which is Psalm 103:4 in the Septuagint. Now, it's regularly translated, and I suspect it's translated this way in your Bible that you're looking at. He who makes his angels wins. Okay, who makes his angels wins and his ministers a flame of fire. But no less of a Greek scholar than Paul Ellingworth opts for this translation that I'm giving you. Okay, and Ellingworth says in his commentary, he says the meaning of the quotation is ambiguous in the Masoretic text, okay, in the Hebrew. It could go either way. He says, which may mean either who makes winds / spirits his angels, messengers. You can translate the word wind spirit. You can translate the word angel messenger. That's why the / okay. Or B, who makes his angels into winds. The Septuagint can't mean B. Okay, the Greek translation of the Hebrew can't mean B. He says in the context of the psalm, which refers to clouds and winds in verse 3, it probably means who makes winds his messengers. And he says the point of the quotation in Hebrews is to show that the angels are only liturgoi, ministers, servants, you see, as verse 14 will confirm. The context in Hebrews, therefore, calls for the translation, he makes winds his angels, and a flame of fire his servants. You see, so it's showing in contrast, they are like just created things that God uses for his purposes. They are not God. You see, they worship the Son. They are not God, and I think that's worth seeing here in this exaltation of Jesus. And then in contrast to what's said about the angels, the Son is addressed as God and is said to have an eternal throne that is ruled with justice. So but regarding the Son, he says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Well, that's quite a difference. The angels are creatures that God uses here, right? The Son is God. And that's a significant thing. So because he loved righteousness and hated lawlessness, God the Father exalted God the Son. He anointed him to a position above all others. And this is from Psalm 45, 6, and 7 in the Masoretic text. Okay, the psalm that's here cited in reference to Jesus, this psalm, it extolled the greatness and the goodness of the Israelite king, referring figuratively in the psalm, referring figuratively to the Israelite king as God, in the sense he was the divinely authorized ruler. The Israelite king was God's representative on the throne, but with reference to Jesus, right, who is the ultimate, the prophesied, ultimate Davidic king. With reference to Jesus, you see, the identification as God applies literally. You see, speaking of this Israelite king, who's God's representative, he can be spoken of that way in a representative fashion as God. But when you speak of the ultimate Davidic king, it now has a literal sense to it. Here's what Murray Harris says in his book, Jesus as God. He says the appellation, and this is hatheos, it's literally it's the God, but when you take it as what's known as a vocative, as an address, which is how it's translated here, it's O God. Okay, says the appellation O God that was figurative and hyperbolic when applied to a mortal king was applied to the immortal Son in a literal and true sense. Jesus is not merely superior to the angels. Equally with the Father, he shares the divine nature. Oh God. Right? He shares this, and this isn't the only place where Jesus is referred to as God, by the way. Okay? So here he says, while remaining distinct from him, where in verse 9 he says, your God. Well, that's perfect Trinitarian, right? He is God, and yet there's a distinction. He goes on, he says, the author places Jesus far above any angel with respect to nature and function, and on a par with God with regard to nature, but subordinate to God the Father with regard to function. There is an essential unity, you see, of nature and being, but a functional subordination. Okay, so this is what you see, I think, being reflected here. In the heavens and the earth, he says, they were made by the Son in the sense that was already noted. They were made by the Son, and that he was God the Father's agent in the creation of the universe. He was the means by which God created these things. And you see he's referring to Psalm 102:25 in the Masoretic text, but you see this same notion, right? In text I listed before, John 1:3, 1 Corinthians 8:6, Colossians 1:16. Jesus is the creator in the sense he is God's agent. He is the instrument of the Father's creation. And so this is what he talks about, and he already mentioned that. And he created order as the created order here as presently constituted. That will be brought to an end. It will be brought to an end not by being annihilated or extinguished and then starting over. It will be brought to an end by being radically transformed into something different. Just like you might say a caterpillar is brought to an end and gone when it becomes a butterfly, right? But it hasn't been, there's continuity involved, and this is what he says, into something that's eternal. It's going to be radically altered. It's going to have the equivalent of a resurrection body. Okay, it is going to be radically altered and changed into something eternal and free of decay, as you see hinted at in Romans chapter 8, verses 18 to 25. It's going to be, his creation is going to be transformed. But Jesus, he remains forever. He has been resurrected, right? He's been immortalized. Death no longer has dominion over him. He's no longer subject to death. He already has a resurrection body. You see? So here he continues. He will continue forever. Whereas this creation is getting this radical transformation. Then he says in verse 13, he quotes Psalm 110:1 in the Masoretic, 109:1 in the Septuagint. He quotes that psalm to which he already alluded to this in chapter 1, verse 3. He quotes that the superiority of the Son to the angels is evident in that no angel was ever exalted to God's right hand. See, to a position of complete supremacy as the Son has been. Right? And regarding to which of the angels ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool at your feet. So he's already talked about this. Douglas Moo in his commentary, he says, in verse 5a, the author quoted Psalm 2:7 to refer to the divine appointment of the Son to messianic royal rule. Now he quotes Psalm 110:1 to refer to the divine invitation to assume the highest office in God's kingdom, with all things subjected to him. Occupying the position at God's right hand indicates a real co-enthronement of the addressee, that is a participation in the exercise of Yahweh's own royal rule. This notion of dominion and rule is reinforced by placing the enemies under the feet of the Son, an additional link to Psalm 2, which celebrates the king's absolute rule over all the nations. So on the contrary, right, angels in contrast. So you have this picture of Jesus, it's mind-blowing. His greatness, his power, who he is. And in contrast, you see here that the angels are servants rather than rulers. Right? They're servants. They're sent out to go and do things. They're merely ministering spirits sent on behalf of the one in authority, sent on behalf of the ruler to serve those who are about to inherit salvation, meaning to serve the disciples of the exalted Lord. Right? To serve them. Douglas Moo says, angels are sent by God to serve believers as they await the coming salvation. So, we have this section here. Now we get the first exhortation. You remember I tell you, the way it's structured, Hebrews is structured, it's exposition, and you have interspersed in the exposition, you have these sections of exhortation. And included in those, you have certain sections of warning. So they are part of the exhortation sections. And here we get the first exhortation section, which is the first warning. In chapter 2, verses 1 to 4, he says, therefore, All right, he's just gone through all this and shown the absolute, complete supremacy of Jesus. Not like an angel. Way above that. Therefore, we must pay even greater attention to the things that were heard, lest we drift away. For if the word that was spoken by angels was reliable, and every transgression and disobedience received just punishment, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation, which having at first been spoken through the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard, God giving further testimony, both by signs and wonders and by various miracles and by distributions of the Holy Spirit according to his will. So given the superiority of Christ to the angels, this superiority that he has gone and established in verses 5 through 14, he then says, therefore, right? In light of that, it is incumbent upon him, the writer, and them, the addressees. That is why he says it is incumbent here that we must pay more careful attention, the writer and those to whom he's writing, and therefore us, right? We have to pay more careful attention. The writer does, his immediate audience does, have to pay more careful attention, even greater attention than they have been to what they've heard. Right? Which is the word that was spoken through the Lord, as he says in chapter 1, verse 2, the message of salvation, as he says in verses 3 and 4. Here we have this inbreaking into our world of this final culminating event of Jesus coming, the kingdom being launched and inaugurated, what people have waited for since the fall. Here is this tremendous news. What has happened? The kingdom has been launched. You see. So here we have this great thing going on. That is the message. Jesus has come. You see, the one who paid the price has been here in history. And this is the message that is given. And say, run with this truth, this gospel message. And the danger of not doing so, you see, of not paying even greater attention to that message, is that one will drift away from God's ultimate revelation. You see, this isn't something you can just cruise through. You are in a war. You're in a war. And if you don't understand that, you're a sitting duck. You can't just put it on autopilot and think I'll just float around. I won't spend any time. I won't sit here and I won't work to pay greater attention to this message. I have to stay close to it. Now I just think I'll blow church off. I won't study. I won't pray, but I'm okay. I'm good. You're just sitting there. You see, you will drift away. You will drift away. People say, well, people stop coming to church. People say, well, are you just a legalist? You just want to check boxes? I'm about ready to shoot myself. Listen, you think it's not important to come and gather with the brothers and sisters? I'm sure the elders can tell you one of the first signs if somebody stops coming to church, it's an indication of something. Right? I'm not talking about somebody gets hit and he's in the hospital. Right? I'm talking about somebody who just can't find the time to gather with the redeemed and come together and sing praises to God and share in his supper and have God speak to them through his word. They just can't be bothered with that. Now that's serious. It's significant, and he's going to say something about that later. But here the thing is that the people are starting, you see, they're drifting away, and that's a danger, you see. They're gradually being pulled away into an abandonment of one's commitment to Christ. That was happening then, that is happening now. You are in a war and you are being lulled. You're being pulled away from everything that is contrary to God, contrary to the Lord. You're being pulled and said, this is what's important. Look, what you need to do is you need to live your life as a performance before other people on social media. That's what's really important. That's what's important. You see, but being a faithful disciple and caring about that and staying in touch with those things and talking about God things and being with God's people, you just hold that loosely and let that kind of go. You see, and what happens? See, drift away. You see? So when somebody urges somebody, you need to be, it's not some kind of, well, I have some, I don't know where we get these ideas. I think we've been poisoned by the church of the 50s. You see? And we still look at church and say, well, this is all, and a lot of people from their childhood experiences. I wasn't raised in the Church of Christ. So I don't have all of this baggage that people bring. I love the Church of Christ. You see? And so this stuff, we're just all this and we're that. I don't know what church you're looking at. Okay, I think you're having nightmares from like 40 years ago or something. But I do think it's important that we urge people to be involved because it's part of spiritual life. It's good. And you will drift away. Okay? You will. So look at it that way. Okay? If somebody encourages you to come to church when you're not coming to church, look at it as though they love me and care about my spiritual life and they understand the spiritual value to being here and that God calls us to be here together. Right? Instead of saying, who are you? Who are you? You my keeper? What kind of an attitude is that? If a brother in Christ comes up to me and says, listen, man, I love you to death, but I think that something's going wrong here and you really ought to make a better effort to get. The proper attitude would be thank you. Right? It would be like, I appreciate you caring about me. Instead of getting this attitude about, who are you to tell me what to do? Well, I see certain things and I'm just trying to help you. You're going to be so prickly, nobody will talk to you, and that will not help you. You see, that will not help you at all. So the motivation for heeding this admonition. Okay, so here, the motivation for heeding this admonition you see in 2 in the first part of 3 is that, look, given that every transgression and disobedience of the word spoken by angels, and what he means here, he's referring to the Mosaic Law. That's what he's talking about. Now that strikes us as odd, and I'll have to let me just say a bit about this and we'll pick up here next week, Lord willing. But you don't really see that. You get the vaguest of hints of angelic involvement in the giving of the law at Sinai. Vaguest of hints, some would say you see no hints. But it clearly was picked up and believed in the intertestamental period that the angels were in fact involved. And you see that in the New Testament. So the Spirit of God confirms that involvement in the New Testament. For example, in Acts chapter 7, verse 38, verse 53, Galatians chapter 3, verse 19. So I just want you to see, when he says the word spoken by angels was reliable, he's talking about the Mosaic Law. So he says, if that word and every transgression and disobedience received, how will we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? The salvation that has been brought to us by the only Son who is light years above angels. Right? If that was the case in neglecting what they were involved in, what do you think is going to happen if we blow off the gospel? Okay, thanks for coming. Well, the screen went off. They must say he's talking too long. I got a minute left. I can say a lot in a minute.